we're thrilled and grateful to the German Embassy to support this event today. There will be 2 more Campus Weeks events. Later in the semester, we'll be showing the film Dutch and having a great panel discussion with Priscilla Lane and Dominic Nieuwhuis on September 22nd. And on November 13th, also as part of the Friday lecture series, we'll have another exciting event about Germany with Professor Lemke, also Dominic Nieuwhuis and Priscilla Lane on Germany's leadership role within the EU and the EU presidency. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about COVID and some other pertinent issues. So looking forward to seeing you every Friday, of course, and at all of our center events, and especially our new Campus Weeks sponsored events. I'm thrilled that we can all be here together. Today is a special event with 2 very important people that have been part of our center. The third is also here from the very beginning, and it's really wonderful to see you and to know that, or to see that faculty members who have been part of the center from the beginning or have joined in the years following are still working with us and are still contributing and are make our center alive and well. And I can't thank you enough for all that you do for our center and for providing these lectures and helping us to foster the dialogue on Europe, because the story is always changing, and we need to keep talking about it, and we need to help figure out how to deal with it. And transatlantic relations are really quite important to discuss at the moment. So the parallels and the best solutions for our common problems. So I will now, I have the pleasure of turning it over to Brent Van Vliet, and a big shout out to all of our TAM students who are here today. It's nice to see you all. Brent Van Vliet is going to take over, and then I'll come back to moderate the Q&A. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Katie. Good afternoon or evening to everyone that's joining us. Thanks so much for being here. And in particular, I want to thank Dr. Christiane Lemke and Konrad Jarausch for joining us today to talk about such an important and fascinating topic. Dr. Christiane Lemke is joining us from Hanover, Germany, where she is currently a university professor of political science at Leibniz University Hannover. Dr. Lemke has studied contemporary German politics throughout her academic career. Her research in the 1980s focused on emerging oppositional groups in East Germany, and in the 1990s she worked on a comparative project on protest in post-communist societies, which compared East Germany with Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. She has also published work on gender and politics and migration in Germany. In 2017, Dr. Lemke wrote the book Germany Today with Helke Welsch, which analyzed major post-unification developments that have tested and shaped the new Germany from a multi-level perspective. Dr. Lemke also serves as adjunct professor in the Transatlantic Master's Program at UNC Chapel Hill. In fact, she was the first DAAD visiting professor at UNC from 1988 until 1991. She has been a visiting scholar at Harvard University and was also the Max Weber Chair in German and European Studies at New York University. From 2006 to 2007, she served as the Director of State Parliament in Lower Saxony, and additionally, she is a media expert on US politics and transatlantic relations for several German and European TV outlets. Dr. Lemke today will be addressing the significance of German unification from a political science perspective as we approach the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Joining Dr. Lemke to provide a historical perspective on the legacy of German unification is Dr. Konrad Jarausch, the Lursi Professor of European Civilization in the UNC Department of History. Professor Jarausch has written or edited about 40 books in modern German and European history, starting with Hitler's seizure of power in the First World War. His research interests have moved to the social history of German students and professions within German unification in 1989 to 1990. With historiography under the communist German Democratic Republic, the nature of the East German dictatorship, as well as the debate about historians and the Third Reich. More recently, he has been concerned with the problem of interpreting 20th century German history in general, the learning process after 1945, the issue of cultural democratization, and the relationship between Honecker and Brezhnev. Professor Jarausch is co-founder of the UNC Center for European Studies, as well as the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam. So I want to give a big thanks once again to both professors for joining us for this talk today. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Christiane Lemke.
very much, Brent, for this wonderful introduction. Yes, I was the first DAAD professor at UNC Chapel Hill in 1988. And let me start with a little anecdote. When I came the chair of the political science department, wonderful person, Dick Richardson, asked me, what would you like to teach? And I said, well, I would like to teach a class on the two Germanys. And he looked at me really puzzled and said, are there two of them? And I said, yes, it's a great case for comparison. We have West Germany, a democracy of market economy. We have East Germany, which is communist ruled, authoritarian, has a planned economy. One is part of NATO and the West, and the other is part of the Soviet bloc. So it's a good case for comparison. And he was kind of convinced. He listed the class as special topics, the two Germanys. Well, I only taught this class one time because the next year, the two Germanys were gone. I mean, we had one Germany, we had, you know, the process of unification in 1989-90. So that was the end of my beautiful course on the two Germanys. And I'm very happy to be with you today to talk about 30 years after unification with my dear friend and colleague, Konrad Jarausch. We were actually colleagues in 1989-90 when all of this happened and had many conversations about the events and what to make of it. I have a brief introduction background for you. Then I would like to talk about continuity and change in German politics and how much East is in the West today. Then I would like to address what we call the unification crisis. There is a big debate about the question, could the crisis after unification, the economic, social, and also political crisis, I should say, have been avoided? And is there a backlash today? And then my last part, and I will keep that brief because it's probably could be a topic for, you know, a new lecture. What is the lasting impact of unification on Germany and Europe? Okay, so to start, this is a picture from Unification Day on October 3rd, 1990, in front of what is today the Parliament building of United Germany. This is in 1990, so you don't see the roof, the glass top on top of the Reichstag. It was built later by Sir Norman Foster in 1990. The German Parliament moved into this building. The fall of the wall in 1989 was the prelude, so to speak, and it was a very unexpected event. Even myself, who was working on East Germany, and I saw kind of the protest groups emerging, did not expect that the wall would come down. There was a mixture of disbelief, but also joy. And I recall when I first learned about the coming down of the wall on November 9th in 1989 from an American journalist who called me in my office in Chapel Hill. I said to him, I don't believe this. So I immediately called. This was before we had internet or cell phones or texts or whatever. We had to use a dial-up telephone. I called my colleague in Berlin and I said, what is going on in Berlin? And first word he said was Wahnsinn. This is out of sight. This is crazy. This is, you know, just crazy. The word Wahnsinn you heard so many times during these days, weeks and months actually, between the fall of the wall in November 89 and unification on October 3rd, 1990. So nobody had really expected. There was no master plan, which is part of the story I will share with you tonight. So just to give you a visual kind of background here, In 1989, the two Germanys, blue is West Germany, orange is East Germany. Bonn was the capital of West Germany, a smaller town far west. East Berlin was the capital of East Germany. West Germany at the point of unification had 63 million inhabitants. East Germany was much smaller with 16 million inhabitants. And I should also point out the heavily fortified border was about 870 miles long, or 1,400 kilometers, separating West from East Germany. So what we are faced with in 1990 is a situation my colleague Helga Welsh and myself tried to capture in this little chart here, where we talk about the two Germanys from 49 to 90, the Federal Republic of Germany or West Germany, the German Democratic Republic of East Germany, and the kind of political systems they had, democracy versus totalitarian, authoritarian, a communist regime. The West German Republic was a parliamentary democracy. It was a federal structure since 1949. And it had a multi-party system, moderate because we had basically three parties forming governments in coalitions throughout the time period 49 to 90. Whereas in East Germany, the Communist Party called SED, Socialist Unity Party, was in charge of everything. There were other parties, but they were called bloc parties. They could not do anything different than the SED would allow them to do. So it was a real closed system. What we see in 1990 is a continuity here. The continuity is that United Germany, again, of course, is a democracy. It is a federal state. It has a parliamentary system with a bicameral system with Bundestag and Bundesrat. And again, it's a moderate multi-party system. And so there's a lot of continuity here. In 1990, the turning point, the whole year of 1990, starting in January, was the process of unification. It was an experiment of social engineering. And I use the term social engineering deliberately because I wanted to share with you that there was no master plan. So what did the Germans do in this historic situation where they had the opportunity to unify? The first and very significant step was what we call the economic union, introduced on July 1. The reason being that a lot of East Germans wanted to have access to the strong West German currency and everything attached to it. So there was high migration from East to West after the wall opened. So the policymakers thought, well, if we want to stop the flow of East Germans to the West, we just introduce the Deutschmark, the West German currency, in the East. But this was a big experiment. Nobody had ever done it. And the exchange rate of 1-to-1 was a political decision to give East Germans one strong currency, Deutschmark, for their what was called the wooden dollar, the East German mark. But in fact, productivity in Germany was meant the exchange rate could have easily been 7 East German marks for 1 to West German Deutschmark. So This whole currency union comes as a shock therapy. Here, actually, what you see in the image is the currency being brought over to East Germany. This is in Leipzig, one of the central banks there, guarded by the East German People's Army. Money was brought, the West German Deutschmark came to East Germany and was exchanged on July 1st when all the East Germans got, hard currency in their hand. But this had a number of repercussions. The East German economy was not competitive, and we had a breakdown of East German business. Actually, a quarter, 25% of all jobs in East Germany were lost due to large-scale plant closings. The Treuhand, an economic trust agency that was set up to privatize East German companies, sold about, I think it was about 10,000 companies between 1991 and 94. They were just sold. Many of them were closed down. So it was really a shock therapy, a term that we usually use for post-communist Poland. I used a source here by Philip Teer, who is a historian, worked on East Central Europe. Political union is very interesting as well, because we talk about unification or reunification, but what in fact happened was we saw an extension of West Germany into East Germany. Because the political leaders wanted to give the process some legitimacy and some legal ground. They used Article 23 of the West German Constitution, the basic law or Grundgesetz, under which states can accede to the Federal Republic of Germany if they decide to do so. And this article was in the Constitution for the Saarland in the post-Second World War period. And it was never, revoked. It just stayed in the Grundgesetz until 1990. And so this was kind of a trick, so to speak, legally speaking. The East German states formed, and every single state parliament voted and decided to accede to the Federal Republic in the course of September 1990. And there was no opposition because the first and last free elections in East Germany in March of 90 brought a political coalition to power that wanted speedy unification. So unification really is an extension of West Germany. The third major area was the international setting for Germany. After all, Germany had been occupied by the four victorious allies of the Second World War, divided up. There was not a peace treaty with Germany. So the allies still had something to say about, what will happen if Germany was going to unify. And here again, there's a craziness. Even the math is crazy. 2 + 4 is 1. The treaty is called 2 + 4, about the international settlement. It was a treaty between West and East Germany, the two German states, and the four former wartime allies. All of them agreed to unification. They all agreed that Germany is now sovereign, and they all agreed that Germany can decide about its security and foreign policy itself in a sovereign way. And there's a lot of discussion about the timing. This international settlement is a diplomatic success story, the way it came about, the way it was possible to convince the Soviet Union with President and the foreign minister to convince the French, who were very reluctant to see a large unified Germany emerging. And the country pushing for unification was the United States. James Baker, foreign minister of George Bush, they were very much in favor of this settlement. So in the end, you know, they signed this treaty in September 1990. I think it would not have been possible 2 years later because politics in the Soviet Union changed and the window would have been closed. So this is really kind of a very interesting, unique process. Okay, how much East is in the West when we look at United Germany? Now, one thing that comes to mind immediately as a political scientist is how much the party system has changed. We have more parties in United Germany. We have varying coalitions in the 16 states of Germany, and on the federal level, there is one new party on the left, the post-communist Die Linke, or the left. And there's also a new party on the right, the right-wing populist AfD, the Alternative for Germany, and I will talk about that party in a minute. So the party system really has changed. What is interesting is that there are very few East Germans in leadership positions in United Germany today. When you look at Angela Merkel, you think, great, here we have an East German who built a successful career. She's the Chancellor of United Germany, a very successful Chancellor. She's in office now for 16 years. But there are very few like her. So in leadership, in public service, but also in business, in universities, very few East Germans really made it to the top. It is also nowadays an issue that the East Germans have fewer assets and savings because they didn't have the time to build up savings. And when you listen to the younger generation in East Germany today, they will tell you, well, we cannot inherit anything. Erbengeneration, no. In West Germany, a lot of people in the younger generation and even my generation were inheriting from our parents who went through the successful economic miracle years and build up some savings and assets. So that's another big difference. The federal government annually, since a couple of years, publishes a report on the status of German reunification. And I'm using that latest report from 2019. And that report states that gaps in income, unemployment rates are closing. But the report is also saying that about half of East Germans in the East are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. And that is a source of real concern and is also the reason why you saw these major demonstrations of Pegida against immigration, and now AfD rallies, and a general disenchantment with the federal but also state governments. I have a couple of slides in a minute about the economic and social situation today. I would still say, this is my second part, is there a backlash against unification? Well, when you look at surveys today and you talk to people, a lot of people will tell you, well, unification is a unique but also a successful project. It's good, Germany is unified, we welcome it, we embrace it. But then when you look more closely, you see that only 38% in the East, in East Germany, feel that unification has, again, these are numbers from the report of the federal government in 2019. Only 38% in the East feel that unification has been successful. Immediately after unification, we saw what we call the Valley of Tears, because unemployment skyrocketed, because people realized that their old society was gone. A lot of the hopes they had were shattered. And there was a certain, what we call nostalgia, or a nostalgic sentiment about East Germany, about the East. And there's a beautiful movie, Goodbye Lenin. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, where they show how East Germans were used to certain products, you know, certain coffees or desserts and brands they would buy in their shops. And they were all gone after unification because the big West German chains, food chains took over. And there are many areas in which the East German felt sorry that all of what they were used to is gone. This is less so the case today, but you still, it depends on the generation you look at. And there's still this feeling of, does our life, does our history really count? Right, and one of the big controversial issues that's being debated now, 30 years after unification, is the question of the deep valley of tears, the so-called unification crisis, could have been avoided. You sometimes read in social science literature, there was no alternative. We had to do it the way we did. And politicians will always say, well, it was great. We succeeded. Look at unified Germany now. But again, if you look more closely, there are a lot of problems up to this day. Privatization was not really a success story because a lot of companies were being sold to West German owners, companies who only closed that factory down. So there is a large-scale deindustrialization in the East German Länder up to this day in many areas. There are some successful urban communities like Dresden, like Leipzig, East Berlin, of course, but many medium-sized cities and small towns that are deserted and have a hard time rebuilding, you know, an economic infrastructure. And like I said earlier, only a quarter of jobs in East Germany were saved, which led to a continued migration from East to West. About 1.4 million East Germans moved to the West. The backlash in politics is even stronger than in culture, I would say. We see that in East Germany, there is much more resentment against refugees coming to Germany after 2000 and in 2015. A lot of anti-foreigner, anti-Islam demonstrations, even though when you look at the map, East Germany did not receive a lot of refugees after 2015. Most of them were housed in the western states of Germany, but still resentment is strong. And the rise of the AfD, the far-right Alternative for Germany, is directly linked to this anti-immigration protest. You hear the phrase, the Merkel government has to go. There's this kind of really stark rhetoric against the government in Berlin, the federal government, and Merkel as a person. She's supposed to be responsible for everything, for all the evils that the East Germans claim there are. What we also see in terms of attitudes, the political backlash is visible in a stronger pro-Russian sentiment in the East German Länder. Especially Vladimir Putin is admired as a strong leader. You don't see that in the West. It is really something that is widespread or more widespread in East Germany. So even 30 years after unification, we still kind of distinguish between West and East Germany in regards to anti-government protests and attitudes. This is not to say that there are no anti-government protests in the West. Certainly we have very powerful anti-government protests in the West as well. But the particular kind of framing of issues, the particular issues that are being addressed are typical and different in the East German Länder. And here I wanted to show a couple of very briefly graphs to kind of visualize what I mean by the Valley of Tears. According to the report on unification from 2019, gaps are closing in terms of unemployment rates, but big but here, when you look at the development of unemployment rates from 1995 to 2017, you see this light blue line on top. This is East Germany, much higher unemployment rates, and particularly very high in the 90s, up to 18, 19%, very high, as compared to West Germany, which is the green line here. There's also a post-unification crisis in the West, but unemployment remains lower. It is going down both in the East and in the West, but still in 2018, it is higher in East Germany. Gaps in income is another very interesting indicator. And the green line on top is West Germany, the average income before taxes. And the blue line is East Germany from 2005, 2018. And here the bars show the discrepancy. And the way you read it is East Germans make 80% of the West German salary in 2005 on an average, and even in 2018, 84%. So the gap is closing, but as you can see here, but it is still visible. Poverty risk, another indicator here. And again, the green line is East Germany, higher risk of poverty in East Germany than in West Germany. These are figures from 1999 to 2017. And you see here this very high risk right after unification in the 1990s. And then it's going down because the West German government transferred, I think, about 3 trillion Deutschmark into East Germany to help alleviate the worst hardships and to create jobs and to build infrastructure. But still, you see these differences, and against this backdrop, you understand why people may be dissatisfied in the East more than in the West. Okay, this is my last slide. I think it is the lasting impact of unification. Here I would like to point out that, of course, unification gave Germany more weight in the European Union and in Europe in general. United Germany is the largest and economically most powerful country in the European Union. Union, as you know, is in Germany, this is being debated as a rise of new responsibilities. Especially right now during the pandemic, the responsibility to cope with this crisis is very clear. And one of the reasons why the German government just this summer shifted to allowing for a large aid budget of the EU to give loans and transfer money to Southern European countries hit harder by the pandemic. Overall, there is a pro-European integration orientation. United Germany stayed in the EU, and it not only stayed, but re-emphasized its commitment to European integration. As of the last couple of years, we also see Eurosceptic parties, especially the party on the right, Alternative for Germany, and sentiments in Germany, just like in the UK or Sweden or Italy. There's more Euroscepticism, but overall, the major parties agree that the EU and European integration is crucial. In terms of the global role, coming back to the continuity and change paradigm, a continuity in foreign policy is probably the most visible and important feature. There is very little change. Germany stayed in NATO. It is committed to the transatlantic partnership, but there's also a new assertiveness. For example, in terms of out of NATO territory missions in which Germany now participates. Germany is advocating a rule-based international order. This is time and again, a major feature of foreign policy. What I also find interesting that there is a new discourse on colonialism, and I think research has just begun to compare the discourse in West and East Germany and to look at the sources and look at the history and traditions in East Germany and as compared to the West on Germany's colonial past. That I think is a new research area and something that was not part of the public agenda for many decades and is now has arrived in Germany. In terms of global politics, Germany is a trading country, export-oriented country. There is a lot of emphasis on economic competition in the global economy, which is another reason why Germany is very much in favor of the European Union, because it benefits from the internal market, but it also feels that only the European Union can stand in a multipolar world with new economic competitors rising, in particularly China, so that Germany would love to see a united European China policy. In terms of the culture of memory, the way we remember East Germany, and I'm sure Konrad has much better insight into this whole topic, the culture of memory. Time and again, we come across articles and research looking into the question, is the East German, the GDR experience fading away? Are we forgetting about the legacies of East Germany? Will East Germany in the end just be a footnote in history? And some of the most exciting and interesting research recently has been to argue that if you study post-Second World War German history, you actually see that West and East Germany are closely linked to each other. Everything that West Germany did, always we had an eye on East Germany and the other way around. these not two, but stand one, you have to look at the other as well. And this is certainly something that is going to stay. In terms of generational change, I do think that there is a fading of memory, but in terms of research, I think there is still a lot to be explored in terms of this mutual influence in East and West. Yeah, Goodbye Lenin, talking about memorials being removed. This is a scene or two scenes from our very, very beautiful movie, Goodbye Lenin, which I usually show in class, a scene where the monument of Lenin is removed from the center of East Berlin and kind of with a helicopter, he kind of leaves the site, and to the surprise of here, one of the main characters in the movie who does not believe her eyes. So goodbye to Lenin, but welcome to you, to your comments. And in particular, I'm looking forward to Konrad's comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, hard act to follow, but that was clear. I don't have a PowerPoint, since I was assuming that Christiane would do the heavy lifting, but I have a somewhat different perspective, although we agree in most interpretive questions. This is a topic that has preoccupied me for the last generation, and I've written several books on it. One of them was a few years ago called United Germany, Debating Processes and Prospects, which was a 25-year-old balance sheet. Now we have another 5 years or even more, and so we have a slightly different perspective. In the first years after unification, German media were full of speculations. Are we united yet? How close, have we gotten to each other? This has fortunately passed away because we have now a new normal, and the new normal is the area from which we're looking backward rather than the normality of division. What I want to do this afternoon for a few minutes with you is take a popular perspective from the East German point of view on what the difference between 89-90 and 2020 is. That is what has actually been out there in terms of hopes and at the same time fears of unification. And you gather that in the slogans of the various demonstrations. I have, for instance, a demonstration diary from Leipzig here, and all you have to do is look at the photographs and go and see what did people want in the peaceful revolution, and then what were they afraid of. And in the second part of my comments, I want to talk a little bit about what did they get, what were the results, and who gained, what were the gains, and what were the losses. And then conclude with just a few sentences on the balance sheet after one generation. Now, if you look at the mass demonstrations in the fall of '89, hopes were expressed everywhere. One of them had to do with free travel, and that already happened with the fall of the wall on November 9th, 1989. And most of you know the infamous press conference in which Schabowski, who was only partly informed, pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket and was then asked, when would this new travel regulation apply? And he kind of mumbled and said, well, immediately. And of course, then people went to the border crossing points, especially the Bornholmer Straße, and actually tested it. And the border police decided to survive That is, they didn't want to get killed by 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people. And therefore they flooded. That is, they opened the gates and people could move back and forth in East and in West Berlin. Now, a second demand was democracy now, and it had a concrete form. Neues Forum was a new organization that, of the fall of '89, that wanted to have a free discussion about the future of the country. They weren't even yet a political party. Other groups did that for them, but they were very popular. A couple 100,000 people signed their petitions. The third dimension had to do with what Professor Lemke indicated, namely they wanted prosperity, and the ticket to prosperity they believed was the West German currency, because it had served as an indirect currency in the East before already. And if you had the blue tiles, which are money from West Germany, you could do almost anything. You could get a plumber to come, otherwise you'd have to wait months and months. But if you had that, then right away. And of course, the problem here was that the East German economy had the productivity of only 1/3 of the West German economy. And by getting the new money, this would increase buying power enormously, but it would also endanger jobs. And then there were slogans, posters, and so on, demanding to get rid of the Stasi, of the Ministry for Security, because, of course, it was not just a foreign spy agency run by Markus Wolf, which tried to figure out what NATO was all about and what the people in Bonn wanted to do and so on, but it was a domestic surveillance agency as well. And a lot of the dissidents and opponents of the regime had been for years spied on. And there's another film that is worth looking at called The Lives of Others. I hope some of you have seen it, and it dramatizes what it's like. And the slogans of the fall of '89 are interesting. First of all, people wanting to leave the country, wir wollen raus, and then dissidents and opponents who want to stay and reform the GDR, wir staying here, wir bleiben hier, and then the classic democratic statement, wir sind das Volk, we are the people, not you stooges in the government. And then finally, after November 9th, relatively quickly, wir sind ein Volk, we are one people or one nation, going from reforming the GDR to unification. Now, what were the fears? Who was afraid? Well, there were neighbors of Germany all the way from Poland and some of the smaller neighbors, Denmark, Holland, and so on, to Israel, because they were afraid that a Fourth Reich was going to come. And even left-wing domestic critics also were afraid of the Fourth Reich. People like the Nobel Prize winner Günter Grass and so on, they talked about a two-component poison, which if you put the two components together, you have World War III. And, the memory of World War I and World War II was still strong enough that a lot of folks did not want the two Germanys to come together. A second aspect of this was, of course, a potential return of the Nazis. And there, the members of the former East German Communist Party, at the time called PDS, tried that in the spring, in January 1990, by having a mass demonstration warning the country and the world that the brown tide was going to rise again. And of course, this is classic anti-fascism and Antifa. And the most Americans pronounce this wrong. And they say Antifa. You know, it's really anti-fascism, okay? And then, of course, there were people in the West, especially the left part of the Social Democrats, who were afraid that the costs would be enormous. Chancellor Kohl believed there would be spontaneous combustion, there would be a post-unification boom, and he would be able to pay it out of his change purse. Well, this is not what happened. Oskar Lafontaine pointed out already that East Germany was wrecked. It was a failing country, and that bringing it up to Western standards would require enormous costs. Now, those are hopes and those are fears. Now, which of those turned out to be correct? Which of them were exaggerated? There were people who gained. First of all, anybody who wanted to travel. And you didn't have to go to Bulgaria or to the Black Sea. You could go to the Mediterranean, or you could even go to the United States. Hey, I mean, you know, it wasn't Canada. It was our great country that people who had not been able to travel wanted to get to know because they had seen movies from there and so on. So, you know, ordinary people could gain the freedom of travel. Then, of course, there were intellectuals and politically involved folks who were happy to get human rights and parliamentary democracy, even if the practice of it turned out to be somewhat more complicated. At least they could have free election, unlike in May 1989, where the elections, you know, had resulted in 98% of vote for the Socialist Unity Party, which everybody knew, especially also the opposition, that they had been falsified. The results are like Lukashenko's results or Putin's results in current East European countries and so on. So those people who wanted free expression, who wanted to be able to speak their mind and so on, were happy that they were no longer persecuted by the Stasi and put into jail. And then, of course, a lot of members of the working class wanted improved living standards, and ultimately the ones that could hang on to their jobs or got retirement pay and so on actually got an improved living standard out of unification. And as I have said a moment ago, people who were shadowed by the secret police and thrown into jails and so on were also happy that the Stasi was dissolved. And then there were, of course, East Germans and West Germans that were happy to see each other's relatives and so on, but on a more diplomatic level, it's the first time in decades that Germany was not a revisionist country. After the First World War, the German Reich was not happy with its frontiers. And in the Third Reich, it was, of course, actively imperialist, racist, expansionist, and so on. And after 1945, even then, the refugees from the East and so on wanted their former territories back. And the 2+4 treaty created a situation where, as one politician said, now Germany is surrounded by friends. That is, it did not have to worry about enemies, and it did not have an agenda of wanting to overthrow the peace settlement. So these are gains for any number of people. There were, however, also losses. First of all, the dissidents had a very disappointing performance in elections, under 5% in the first free election, which also meant that their project of creating a third way of reforming the GDR without unifying it with West Germany was a failure, because the great majority of the East German population wanted unification now, and they did not want to play further socialist games or experiments. Then, of course, especially women, and I'll get to that in a moment, but regular workers had jobs lost because their companies went belly up. There was massive unemployment. You saw the graph from Professor Lemke before. The figures may even be larger, 20%, 25%. There were a lot of folks in some retraining measures. A lot of folks got put into early retirement, put out to pasture, as it were, even though they could have still continued working and so on. So that the working force in East Germany shrinks overall by about a third immediately. And some of the people who kept working had to scramble to get new jobs, which in a situation in which there was not officially any unemployment, like in a socialist country, that was a shock. People didn't know how to get new jobs and so on. Then there were, of course, also people who had depended on socialist welfare. Now, that was not as extensive as in West Germany, but still, if you were a pensioner, if you were ill, there were a lot of welfare provisions in East Germany. Food was cheap, transportation was cheap, housing was ridiculously cheap, and so on and so forth. So all those things became Western. There was a currency, was buying power, but there was also a great deal of price increase, so that East Germans were shocked. Women were often the first ones to let go in factories, because factories in East Germany had also served as social networks, as social nodes. There were writer groups, theater groups, movie groups, and so on, that were dependent upon, that were financed by factories, kindergartens, old age homes, vacation places at the Baltic or in the mountains, and so on. And most of those were staffed by women. And when push came to shove with the trusteeship agency, and the question was, would the company survive, then the first thing it got rid of was the female labor force and the social auxiliaries, so on. And in East Germany, over 90% of the women had been gainfully employed, whereas in West Germany, only somewhere around 70%. So that there was also an expectation that everybody should work, which was not the case in the West, because many women were still at home as mothers and so on. And then, of course, some of the West Germans bitched as well, because with the several trillion Deutschmark and eventually Euro transfers to reform the infrastructure of the East, to patch up, to create new roads and rehabilitate broken buildings and so on and so forth. You know, all those things, this was very expensive. And if you lived in a socially challenged area in the West, like in the Ruhr Basin that was also being deindustrialized and lost its coal and steel, like Krupp and Rheinhausen, then you wanted this money to be spent on your own problems, and you did not want to have it sent over to East Germany. So ultimately, and let me conclude, the balance is rather mixed. It had to do a lot with expectations. Some cynics in the West always maintained that the East Germans wanted to work like in East Germany, which meant not very hard, and get paid like in the West. And that, of course, in a capitalist economy was wishful thinking, that this, of course, did not happen. Overall, as Professor Lemke has pointed out, the perspective is still positive, but the negative aspects have become clearer, and there is now a debate about whether or not they are the result of a broken legacy of a failing state of GDR, or whether they're the result of mistakes during the unification process. And there are sufficient indications that it's not only the legacy of East Germany, but that it's also mistakes in the privatization, for instance, that are responsible for some of the difficulties in the East. Moreover, the East Germans were always looking west instead of looking east. And when you travel in Eastern Europe and you come back from Poland and you come to Frankfurt Oder, the first major city on the Oder River in former East Germany, that town looks tremendously Western, okay? Whereas if you come from West Germany, from one of the richer areas to Frankfurt Oder, then you're afraid you have landed somewhere in post-communism. So the question is also which way you're looking. When you're looking towards your Western cousins and say, why are they driving Mercedeses when I drive a VW? Then of course you are angry. Whereas if you look towards Romania and say, why are we driving a VW when they are driving some kind of Polski Fiat or whatever, then you ought to be contented. The impact depended upon age and relationship to the party, because ironically, if you were a pensioner, you did well because West German pensions were higher than in the East. And if you were young and you were able to take advantage of West German university training or international fellowships to come to the United States, to come to Chapel Hill, then you were doing well. You were doing especially badly if you were 55 or so, and you were just at the point where you would have taken over responsibility of very important jobs. Those jobs all disappeared, and West Germans came in and took over most of them. So it has to do with that, and it has to do whether you were an opponent of the regime, whether you were neutral, or whether you were a former functionary. There was therefore a new stratification with winners, the people who were capable of creating independent businesses, sometimes former Stasi members and stuff, and losers, people who did not make it in the new competitive situation. Now, internationally speaking, of course, Professor Lemke is correct, and the latest book that I have here from a colleague is called Der Aufsteiger, Germany as somebody who is kind of risen in the world and is a parvenu. That, of course, is the subject of another talk, and therefore I will quit right here and thank for your attention.
Thank you, Konrad. Thank you, Christiane. I have a feeling, Christiane, that you might want to maybe just comment briefly, and then we have questions lined up in the chat. Christiane.
Well, thank you very much, Konrad. I mean, the beauty of the historian came out very clearly that you are you really brought to life how people felt and what they were hoping and what they feared. And I think this was just beautifully kind of described, the way you talked about the hopes and the fears and the different strata. You know, people were affected very differently from unification, depending on whether they were, like you said, in their 40s or 50s, or whether they were young, whether they were men or women also plays a role. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And also whether they were opposing the East German regime or felt very comfortable in East Germany because they were privileged, because, you know, that was part of the communist regime, that you had privileges if you were a party functionary. And if you were not, you were really, if you were in opposition, I mean, this was a liberation, no question. I very briefly want to touch upon 2 points you made. One was, I think this is one of the most interesting questions: were mistakes made during unification? Mm. Because sometimes, you know, in the discourse in Germany, we tend to blame the East Germans, you know, their legacy being authoritarian, not being used to democracy, you know, that was all wrong. So how should they learn to be good democratic citizens? But no, I mean, that's not the full story. The problem goes much deeper. There were mistakes being made, but up to this day, you find very few West Germans who will say so openly and say maybe the process of privatization should have been done differently. Maybe the exchange rate of money was wrong. And another topic was, should we write a constitution for United Germany, or should we just take over the West German basic law that was there already? And here again, a process involving the East Germans much more actively would probably have been better for long-term perspective of the legitimacy. So the question of, were mistakes being made, were mistakes made, and what kind of mistakes? Not that we can reverse them. I mean, that's all history now, but that we can move away from this shaming of East Germany and East Germans, saying, you know, they are not really wired right. They don't know what a democracy is. They had difficult paths. The other kind of interesting point about the women, and I'm glad you mentioned that the employment rate in East Germany was much higher, and that in East Germany a lot of social services were tied to your job, including childcare facilities were readily available in East Germany. And here we see some of the shortcomings of West Germany, which failed to introduce reforms in many areas, including providing public childcare. Even though in West Germany, women were highly qualified, they wanted to work, West Germany is a laggard when it comes to providing childcare facilities. And so one of the second question that is often debated, can we learn something from East Germany? Is there something good in the East German development that we can learn from? It was not all bad. Well, just to close on my remarks on a brief note about COVID-19, I heard some interviews on TV about East Germans just recently about unification and the unification crisis. And one of the East German women said, I think COVID-19 lockdown is a crisis. You have not lived in East Germany in the 1990s when factories closed and people were laid off on a large scale. That was a crisis. And I mean, you can debate this, what was worse. Certainly, you know, the lockdown and the current situation in terms of employment and the economy is very severe. But I thought it was kind of interesting to see this resilience in that comment. If you want to know what a crisis is, you should have lived in East Germany in the 90s.